All right, so we're just going to give this about 30 seconds to a minute for the room to populate as people come in from the waiting room. There's always that little awkward moment of, we were talking before we came on stage about, the changes from before COVID till now. And one of the things is like, in the before, we'd have the entire audience in the room waiting for the Attorney General's car to pull up in front of the building or something. And now it's like the Attorney General has to get here first and everybody else has to be waiting to come in. It's a very different dynamic.
It's a little different.
But it does look like people.
Okay. Well.
So much has changed. But I see people are coming in.
Okay.
And we are on camera. So. And I'm getting texts from people to let them know that they can hear us talking about the waiting period here. So it's all good. I'm just going to give it about maybe, let's say 15 more seconds and I'll start an introduction.
Great.
All right. Well, we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeremy Burton, and I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Boston. 4 years ago this month, JCRC leaders sat down with Attorney General Healey to discuss her priorities and agenda for the new administration shortly after the last inauguration. It's fair to say that a lot has happened since then, some of which was imagined in that conversation and some of what was unimaginable. Now, 4 years later, and after another inauguration in Washington, we've invited our Attorney General back to reflect on the last 4 years, to share with us what she's anticipating for the Biden administration, how she sees this work playing out in our Commonwealth, and her priorities for the coming years. We also want to take this opportunity to share with Attorney General Healey the priorities of the organized Jewish community in Greater Boston. In part, informed by the meeting we had 4 years ago, and certainly very much by the values we cherish as a community. Over the last 4 years, JCRC has been focused on 3 key areas of domestic policy: supporting our immigrant neighbors, protecting democracy, and advancing racial justice. And in addition, something that really wasn't part of that conversation 4 years ago is how central combating anti-Semitism and violent hate in all its forms has been, sadly, for our work since we last sat down with the Attorney General. And here, I will note that while it's been 4 years since we had a sit down like this with you, I want to thank you and particularly appreciate the numerous times we have been together as Attorney General Healey has shown up for us so many times over the last 4 years, standing with us at Temple Israel after Charlottesville, standing with us on the Common after the horrific murders in Pittsburgh, and so many other situations. We've really seen a lot of each other in hardness and sadness, and in good time and in pursuing the work we share together. So with a new presidential administration and a new legislative session for the Commonwealth, we start a new chapter in this work and our partnership with the Attorney General. Before we begin, I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Anti-Defamation League of New England, AJC New England, and the Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action. We are grateful for their partnership in so much of our collective work. I'll now introduce our Attorney General, and she'll make some opening remarks. We'll then have time for a Q&A. A reminder to you in the audience that you can submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Attorney General Maura Healey is the Chief Lawyer and Law Enforcement Officer of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Attorney General's Office is an advocate and resource for the people of Massachusetts in many ways, including protecting consumers, combating fraud and corruption, investigating and prosecuting crime, and protecting the environment, workers, and civil rights. Thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. It's great to be with you and our friends, my friends at JCRC, and the wonderful organizations that are co-hosting. And yeah, you referenced those times that we've been together, and those were in moments of tremendous sadness and grief and pain. They were also reminders of the opportunities we have to work together and build forward. And, as you also listed the priorities, those are my priorities. So that's nice. JCRC's priorities, my priorities, they really line up. And I'm not surprised, and just again, so happy to be back with all of you. I'm going to make a few remarks, but then I do want to get to the questions and be able to talk to all of you. Yeah, a lot's gone on since I spoke to you 4 years ago. At that time, we were only a few days into the Trump administration, talking about emerging challenges, filing our first lawsuit to stop the Muslim ban. But little did we know all that we were going to get ourselves into. We talked at that time about the need to maintain our core values as a country. We talked about the continued fight for healthcare and our environment. We talked about the rise in hate crimes and anti-Semitic incidents in our communities and what my office was doing to help. We talked about the importance of tolerance and inclusivity and the celebration of diversity. What's transpired over the last 4 years has been challenging, to say the least, but JCRC has always served as a light in dark times. For generations, you've been a driving force behind so many important issues, and I just really appreciate the work that you have done. We're now making our way into a new year, a new administration. There is hope on the horizon. It's nice that vaccines have come online. The focus needs to be on equitable distribution. It's nice we have a federal administration that believes in science, humanity, compassion, the rule of law. And for me, in my role as your Attorney General, my commitment to the people of this state and this country remains the same. It's also a bit of a new chapter for my office, a refresh, a reset for our work after 4 years of fighting basically nonstop to protect bedrock rights and policies. We filed hundreds of comment letters, briefs, lawsuits to stand up for people. But our work doesn't stop here. And I'm encouraged looking at and realizing the opportunity we have in front of us. I think that the twin epidemics of COVID-19 and this moment of racial reckoning that's finally, here, it seems, in a particularly powerful way after 400 plus years of systemic racism. So much has been broken apart and dismantled. We've seen the fragilities in all of our systems. I think from my perspective, this gives us an opportunity to not go back and rebuild, but to really build in new and different ways. And I'm excited about what we can do here in New England and in the Commonwealth. We got to tackle hunger, the eviction crisis that's looming, student debt, defending workers' rights in a gig economy. We've got to rebuild our healthcare system and ensure that every policy, every lawsuit, every idea, certainly that's coming out of my office, doesn't create or exacerbate further disparities or harm in communities that have been left behind for so long. And we'll continue, going after the big companies that do wrong: Facebook, Google, Purdue Pharma, McKinsey, Exxon, holding them accountable. My work with other AGs abroad in the country has never been stronger. And, I just want you to know I'm proud to lead the Democratic AGs. I try to work with all of my AG colleagues on collective goals, and certainly protecting the election has been key among them this year. The other day, I announced a big settlement with McKinsey. The opioid crisis, though it's fallen off the front page, some continues to be a top priority. And we're going to continue to fight the Sacklers in court and look to bring more resources for treatment and recovery for our communities that have been so devastated. And the issue of racial equity is the top priority and focus of everything that we do in my office. And this gets to, all the amazing work that you have done to combat hate and hate crimes and look to defeat white supremacy and anti-Semitism that we see all too prominent and rampant. I know many of us have spent the last few days watching videotapes, horrific happenings at the Capitol. And you see in that the intersection of so many of those problematic cancers really on our society. So we got to do everything we can to safeguard and expand civil rights, to dismantle racial injustice wherever we see it, whether it's in healthcare or employment, education, the economy, the environment, criminal justice. And we've got to end white supremacy once and for all. We have a once in a lifetime opportunity to do this. We have to do it. We have to seize it. And I look forward to the work we have ahead of us. I look forward to working with all of you. And I thank you for the opportunity to have a conversation here today.
Thank you so much. And as you say, your agenda in so many ways is our agenda. And I think it's part of the relationship we have is that we share so many priorities. I do want to maybe dig in a little deeper on some of the things you raised and talk particularly about the role that we have to play in Massachusetts. And, I will go back again to the 4 years ago when we were talking about not just, okay, so we have you as our attorney general, you're going to join these lawsuits, you're going to fight like hell in Washington. But it's almost like you didn't need us to do the work of lobbying you, so to speak, to do that. Your heart was there, your passion was there. And now we're thinking again, both about what we can do to have an impact here. And that's sort of a framework I want to explore. You talked about, so I'll, to use one example, we talked about, protecting this last election. And yes, obviously some people are probably dual screening even at this moment, the outcome of that. And there was certainly something that went on with AGs around the country playing very, very different roles in the weeks after the election. But we're also closer to home here in Massachusetts. We at JCRC worked with many others to ensure that there was mail-in voting last year, to expand the ways to do so safely. And I would say that was a big success in Massachusetts. So I'm wondering how you are thinking specifically about defending democracy here in the Commonwealth, both in terms of the work that needs to be done and your role in that.
Well, look, I'm a little biased, but I think as Massachusetts goes and as we lead, so can go this country. I think that Massachusetts has always occupied a pretty special place when you think about, the fact that we were first to universal health care, the first to marriage equality. In earlier times, we played a significant role in the abolition movement. And the anniversary we just celebrated last year of 100 years of women's suffrage. And so I really think that with our combination of intellectual capital, human capital, history, some core values, we've got to do everything we can within our own state to make good on and lead on policies. That's the first order of business. You talked about voting. Yeah, I spent a ton of time, and my team did, over the last year working to protect the election. As you may remember, I joined with others to sue the Postal Service when the Trump administration was trying to screw around with that in a way that would have affected and disenfranchised hundreds of thousands of people. We were successful. We then had nearly 60 suits, I think, against the Trump administration. Collectively, states to defend against efforts to further suppress the vote in places. I think here in Massachusetts, we've seen the benefit of important reforms that many on this call have led to make happen. I mean, same-day voting registration, expanded early voting. This is stuff that we've got to make sure is locked in, vote by mail options. We've got to take what we did through COVID and expand on that even more to make it easier for people to vote. We, as I say, thanks to your efforts, we have some good reforms in place, but we've got to build on that. We also need to recognize that around this country right now, there are Republican-led state legislatures that are looking to undo every single innovation that was made to further allow access to the ballot. And we're going to fight that in court. And I appreciate Amica's support for that, because that's going to be a real battle over the next 2 years. So I think, those are some of the things. I think, Jeremy, also, in this age of misinformation and disinformation, I am going directly to the platforms, Google, Facebook, Twitter, others, to demand, I'm leaving an AG letter on this, reforms to the platforms to deal with the misinformation, the disinformation, the threats of violence to public officials, election officials, and others. So much of this perpetrated by, the likes of the Proud Boys and white supremacist groups. We also, though, while doing that, I think need to make sure that we are informing our public here, promoting civics education, promoting people's understanding of how government can work for them, and really demanding that from elected officials. And so those are some ideas about what we've got to do, I think, here in Massachusetts, and that extends and has ripple effects, beyond our borders.
You've covered so many topics just in that one answer that I'm already seeing questions coming in even about some of those things. So a reminder to the audience that we have the Q&A function. I know we're 11 months into this, but I think people are starting to figure that out. Please use it. There is a question for the audience, and you touched on this a little bit, but I want to, pull this out and maybe go here now, around this issue of white supremacy. And, clearly for our community, we experience this profoundly in terms of the attacks in Pittsburgh and Poway. We've also stood with other communities over the last 4 years after Christchurch. So many of us were at the ISBCC Mosque to stand with them that day on Friday, Juma services. There's so many other ways that this has impacted our lives, but it's also been here at home. And so Rabbi Mike Rothbaum, notes in the questions that, here in Acton, there have been racist and anti-Semitic hate crimes. And he's not alone there in the Commonwealth, where we have seen anti-Semitism, racism, white supremacy in crimes, in graffiti, and so many other incidents. And I guess the question very concretely is what we can do and what the AG's office can do specifically to identify and prosecute white supremacy and domestic terror here in Massachusetts.
It's a great question, Rabbi. So just this past week, I partnered with Senator Adam Hines and Representative Tom Wynn to file legislation that would strengthen our criminal hate crimes statutes. Massachusetts, has hate crime laws on the books, but they don't really give us, they're not nearly as strong as those in other states, and they're really hard to enforce. And so my criminal bureau worked with my civil rights team in drafting legislation that reworks the existing laws to better reflect the intended purpose. That is to charge individuals who target a person based on their membership in a protected class. So I ask and hope for your support with our friends in the legislature in getting that law passed. My civil rights division, which is where I started out, of course, in the AG's office back in 2007, continues to be very active. Let us know about hate incidents in your communities. Sometimes it might be that we're able to go out and get a civil rights injunction against a perpetrator, or we're able to work with a school and a community on the steps necessary to provide accountability. I think about my friend Robert Treston and ADL over the years, doing great work in schools and communities on that, because it is about prevention and outreaches in addition to accountability. I established that hate crimes hotline back after Trump's election in November, because we saw an uptick in reports of bias-motivated threats and harassment and violence, and that remains open. We provided guidance to schools on how to prevent and address hate-based incidents, particularly those impacting our young people. And I've worked hard to try to build trusting relationships with vulnerable communities. I set up a Race and Equity Council, a Council on New Americans. And the point there is that every month or so, my team is convening with stakeholders and leaders from around the state to understand, and be informed about what's happening. We've done trainings on hate crimes with law enforcement and local officials. And we've designated prosecutors specifically in the office to handle hate crime referrals and investigations. So the resources are there. But I think a big thing, right now is what we're seeing happen in Congress as we speak. I mean, this is about accountability. I mean, what happened at the Capitol is just emblematic of what we've seen bubble and surface. You recounted some of the horrific incidents, Jeremy. All these things are tied together, And when we saw that mob of rioters perpetrating an insurrection in real time with just, racist, anti-Semitic, certainly anti-American words, language, symbols, flags, that's appalling. And certainly it was appalling to see a sitting president leading members of his party to incite, those individuals to violence. So it's about accountability. Congress has got to do its job and remind everybody that no one is above the law. And I hope that an adequate number of Republican senators find within themselves, it's not even courage. It shouldn't take courage to do what's right. It's also the oath you swore to uphold when you became a senator. I hope they can do what is their job and their responsibility. It also means going after, as others have right now, individuals within our states who traveled to the Capitol and may have committed crimes by either conspiring within our states to perpetrate that violence, or I know a tremendous amount of activity is happening right now in the District of Columbia, both in the U.S. Attorney's Office and in the D.C. AG's office. It's about accountability and calling that out and calling it out here. We've got to do better on the platforms. I mentioned that, these social media platforms, they know everything about us. They've got all sorts of algorithms to figure out, what to try to sell us. One thing we demanded as soon as we became aware of it is that they take down the posts, the ads for military gear that were running alongside some of those hateful posts inviting people to insurrection. I mean, that just should not happen. They've got a way to identify hate and violence-filled rhetoric and do something about that. And we really have to demand that. And we've got to whenever there's an incident here, we've got to work with law enforcement and really hold people accountable. Hold people accountable in workplaces, right? And just be really loud and clear that, unfortunately, I think we had a president who gave license to certain behaviors, normalized nationalism, normalized white supremacy for some, increased anti-Semitism and other hate-inspired incidents. And, it's a new day. And we've got to be really clear that, all of us are going to call it out and hold those accountable who really degrade and devalue, what this country is supposed to be all about.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Attorney General, for the work you've been doing in this space. I will note for our audience that we have a link that we also include on our website, and I know it's on Combined Jewish Philanthropy's website and other, that when you see a hate crime, we encourage you to report it to the ADL hotline. As I think our audience knows, it's very important for our community that ADL is able to track hate and specifically potential anti-Semitic incidents, both so that we can document that information, but also, frankly, to hold our public officials accountable when those events happen. So I would encourage people, in addition to the information provided by the Attorney General, to be aware of the ADL hotline. And there is a follow-up question just to ask that in terms of this hate crime legislation that you've sponsored with the members of the House and the Senate, if we can get the numbers out on those bills from the House and Senate numbers out.
Sure.
You can include those in the follow-up if you would like.
Great. Caitlin from our team is on the call. Caitlin, if you can get in touch with our P&G team and maybe put in the chat, it needs the title. I don't know if anything has a number yet, but Caitlin will post that during this call.
All right. And we can include that in the follow-up email as well. I want to, there are so many issues and there are questions starting to come in, but we talked about racial justice, and we both made mention of it. And obviously here in Massachusetts, we adopted very important new police reform legislation right at the end of the session. It was, certainly a compromise, and at the same time, it also certainly moved the Commonwealth forward, but not in every way that we all hoped for and imagined. And I know that you had weighed in on various aspects of it during the course of that discussion. I think people are interested to hear, sort of how you see implementation and enforcement and the role of your office, specifically with regard to that new legislation. And also, frankly, if there's anything undone that you would see yourself taking up in the new session that's just beginning.
Well, I want to start by thanking everybody who worked hard to push for and support the police reform legislation. And, you're right, Jeremy, it's certainly a compromise, as all pieces of legislation are. With that said, I was really glad to see this done. And I think there are some very good things that came from this. I mean, we now have a new commission that's going to certify and decertify police officers statewide. I actually have responsibility for filling a few of the seats on that commission, and I'm busy putting together names to fill slots on that position, as well as some task forces that have been created. There were limits put on use of force, bans of chokeholds, limits on use of tear gas. There was the creation of a duty for police officers to intervene when they see another police officer using inappropriate force. And importantly, the legislation gave my office the authority to civilly investigate police departments that engage in racial profiling or mishandle complaints of unprofessional conduct. So there are some good things regarding use of force, transparency, and accountability. We all know that, the key is implementation, right? Otherwise, you've just got a law and words on a page. And that's going to require a lot of outreach, training, and involvement. And, it's going to be consistent and concerted. And there's more work to do. I mean, one of the things that came up during this debate was the use of, for example, facial recognition. And, there have been reports and studies showing that facial recognition as a technology presents real concerns around racial bias, particularly against Black men, also against Asian Americans. And, we need to address this. And so, as part of the new law, there is a focus on data collection and studying it with an eye towards making additional changes as necessary to ensure that facial recognition is not wrongfully targeting people of color. We use facial recognition to help identify unknown individuals. That individual could be a suspect, a victim, or a witness. It's just one of many tools that we use, for example, in my office. Whether it's our high-level narcotics investigations or individuals involved in human trafficking, money laundering at casinos and elsewhere. So, it is an investigatory tool that's used to corroborate. It's never used as the only basis in our cases, for sure. But, we do part of, these technologies, right? If they're developed and evolved, created by, a certain group of individuals, maybe predominantly white, and you see then that it didn't cover everything that it needed to cover, and it didn't account for racial bias. And so, we also need to develop new technologies that account for that and make sure that people aren't unfairly being targeted And so that's something that I think we need to do more work on, Jeremy.
Okay.
So we'll be on it. I'm glad this legislation is here, and now we just got to do the hard work of implementing it.
I appreciate there is I will say certainly come back to us when, we did post the hate crime statute. Thank you to your staff. We posted the docket numbers in the chat. As these things develop, particularly if there's a place where it's your assessment that the community needs to be making its voice heard, if there's, a particular legislation that you are drafting or proposing on that, we stand ready to work with you on that. So let's just say that right up front.
I really appreciate it, because we've seen it across the state, especially during the election, following the election. There continue to be protests. I get alerts of them every day. And there's some really ugly, to say the least, activity and behavior out there. And we've just got to be really clear that we're not going to stand for that.
Since we are talking about police reform, there is a question from the audience from Ben. I think it's more of a clarifying question, really just to understand what are the laws and what are the rules about officers and body cameras, and to the extent that, are they required? Are there conditions under which the law allows them to be turned on or off? And whether you have any thoughts about that specific topic.
Yeah, I think that body cameras in general have been a positive, both in modifying behavior of police officers, but also, it does have an effect too sometimes on those who are interacting with police officers. I think that it's been left sort of to department to implement. And there are rules around when those body cameras have to be on when people are at work. And then there are other rules around who has access to that information, how that information needs to be stored for how long, and all of that. So I think it continues to be a space where more will need to be done, more refinements need to be made. But I think that they've proven to be a positive. And I just look back at that incident a few weeks ago with that Boston police sergeant caught on camera bragging about driving down the street during one of the protests following George Floyd's murder, and bragging about hitting individuals. So many things problematic about that. But hey, wasn't it good there was a body camera there?
Yeah. So I'm just keeping an eye on the questions that are coming in, and there are now several questions. I'm trying to pull them together here. But there are a number of questions that have to do with combating anti-Semitism specifically. And, I'll introduce this, and with apologies to Alan and others who've posed the questions, I'm going to consolidate and frame this a little bit. There have been some debates over how to fight how to combat anti-Semitism and how to understand the definition of anti-Semitism in that effort. And it's certainly, I will say up front, it is the view of the Jewish Community Relations Council and the organized Jewish community broadly that the definition that was enacted several years ago by the International Holocaust Remembrance Association on defining anti-Semitism and its usage is a good tool for education and engagement with regard to what is anti-Semitism and how it expresses itself in current realities. And it's a definition that has been endorsed by many European countries. Here in the United States, it was actually sponsored by Secretary Kerry when he was the Secretary of State, and he led the way for that international endorsement. And just in the last week or so, the Biden administration has again, through the State Department, reaffirmed their commitment to this definition. There is some tension around sort of the fact that we have a working definition, and then there's and how does that apply to actually defining hate speech or restricting hate speech or enforcing federal laws or state laws with regards to hate or discrimination in that regard. And I'm just curious how you think about that, how you think about those issues of hate speech and how you think about hate activity.
Yep.
And
guys, I'm having a Zoom moment where my battery was running low.
Okay.
So forgive me, I just had to plug in.
So
Okay.
I just, I would love to, just invite you to reflect on, that there is this definition. And I will say, before, as I will say up front, and, in all candor of this audience, I think this definition and the use of it has gotten a little more divisive, not because there is a lack of consensus within the community, but because, frankly, some have perceived that the way the prior administration used it may have been going beyond its use as an educational tool to like a law enforcement definition. So I'd love, to the extent that you can reflect on that, or any thoughts you have on defining anti-Semitism and
Yeah,
combating.
well, look, I'd like to take a look at the language again. I think for purposes of our hate crime work, say, we clearly focus on things that under the law fall within protected classes. So, whether that's ethnicity or religion, I think that's where you see acts that are anti-Semitic, held accountable in the criminal justice system. Your comment about just sort of the broader education. I mean, I think there's absolutely a room for law enforcement, and you need to be there. You also need to be there in the education space, and part of it is getting people to understand that anti-Semitism isn't just a problem for the Jewish community. It's a problem for all communities. And I don't want to offend anyone. I just think that part of my job, and what I've been trying to say too as a civil rights advocate, is that if you're talking about anti-Asian racism or Islamophobia or attacks against Indigenous people or the LGBTQ community or immigrants, it's like everybody is part of some group, and discrimination, marginalization against anyone is an affront to everyone, right? And so getting people to understand that is important, and to bring more people on board with support to rid us of anti-Semitism. I think that's one way you get there, is by pointing out the commonalities, and the commonalities in some of what leads people to the behavior that we see. I mean, the time spent, and this is where I'd like to see more federal law enforcement and research and effort. What is it that brings people into hate groups, into white nationalism, white supremacist groups? What do we do to head that off? So I guess that's just a reflection, Jeremy. And I welcome further and deeper engagement with you and others about this specific topic.
Well, maybe I'll follow up and try to pull something out of one of the questions that's here about this, and then and we'll move on to other topics afterwards, which is like, happy to send you a link to the working definition of anti-Semitism that we use and that has been adopted broadly, again, by the State Department and the international community. But beyond that particular definition, do you have any reflections on the importance of defining hate in terms of law enforcement, for in terms of like defining racism in order to prosecute hate crimes, or defining anti-Semitism in order to prosecute hate crime laws? How important is it to have working definitions in law in order to effectively enforce hate crime statutes, for example?
Well, I think it's important. I mean, that's part of what our update is to the hate crime laws here. You've got to actually have something that a prosecutor and a judge can look to and then apply. So I think that is really important, and that's part of what we've tried to clean up and modernize in our legislation. And to me, it's also about the broader topic of education and naming it, calling it out, and explain to people in clear terms what that is, what that means, what that looks like.
Yeah. So thank you for that, and I'm sure we will have follow-up conversation. And obviously, we're going to take we'll take a look at the new act, and we'll have that conversation with you and work together to make sure we have the tools available to you in law enforcement in order to protect all the Commonwealth. Interesting question on gun laws. And this is a topic I think actually did come up when we met 4 years ago. And I think when last we sat down with the community this way, Massachusetts had recently passed some of the most forward-thinking gun laws or in the country in terms of restrictions on the availability of these weapons. And frankly, in the final years of the the Obama administration, now the prior administration, we had worked very closely, particularly with GBIO and their national network around executive side action from President Obama, which didn't really end up happening in the final days of the administration. And then I think it's fair to say that nobody's kind of like really prioritized this over the last 4 years as something to expect federal legislation or federal action from the administration on. So, here we are, it's 2021, this is not a new issue. And Mike asks, do you foresee any chance that federal action on curbing gun deaths could occur in the next few years? And what would we need to do to help make that happen?
Yeah, well, Michael, I sure hope so. This has been, as many of you know, a top priority for me. And early on, I was a big time supporter of that legislation that updated our gun laws. And my office has been responsible for successfully defending, winning every single challenge brought by the gun lobby. And there have been many over the last many years. So I'm really proud of our record, and I give huge credit to the lawyers in my office who just did fantastic lawyering all the way up to the Supreme Court and back on so many cases. Like every regulation, every law, it seemed that our state passed got challenged, but we defended it. But we need national legislation, right? Because 60% of the guns that turn up in crimes here in Massachusetts come from other states with lax laws. And so we've talked about the need for background checks and for the sharing of information between and among localities, states, and the federal government. I'm a big proponent, for example, of giving funding to the CDC to actually study gun violence. Gun violence, I frame as an issue of public health, right? Because whether it's domestic violence, whether it's violence in communities, or whether it's in the situations that we've seen with all too frequency, these mass shootings. And, I go back to the Boston Common and standing with all of you following the Tree of Life massacre. I mean, we need federal action. Can it happen? I think it can happen. I think that part of the conversation right now and the focus on violence, real violence, this is scary stuff. When I talk to the Attorney General in Michigan, remember all those people that showed up with guns at the state capitol there? I mean, you've seen image after image over the last year alone, right? I hope this raises more consciousness about what's actually, what actually leads to what, and what just doesn't make sense for a society. And so I think if we can work on and work from, some of the immediate issues around that we've been talking about, that that were part of the insurrection, I think that there is a tie there, and I think that there will be more appetite. I also think, look, the NRA has been, the NRA has taken its lumps. Filed for bankruptcy. It's getting a serious investigation by my colleague in New York. Its power has weakened, and we just need to, those of us who support common sense reforms have got to stay active. I'll tell you from personal experience, whenever I do something in this space, the outcry is super loud. Like there's just a small but very voluble group, right? That can be scary and intimidating. And I would just encourage those of us on the other side of this to equally and surpass those voices. Jeremy, you worked in government, right? I mean, you know what I'm talking about. Like, it's like you hear from the haters way more, but then that lends itself to a perception that there are way more people out there that don't want to don't want anyone to touch anything to do with their guns. And that's just not true. And a lot of gun owners support many of the reforms that we're talking about on the national level. So I would encourage that, but you remember the early days when I enforced our state's law banning assault weapons. I mean, boy, protest, vitriol, and the like, and it was the right thing. But you just saw in that how loud that again, it's a minority view, but how loud
And I'm guessing,
that could occupy.
yeah, I'm guessing that, there's a lot of stuff that your office sees. I mean, I know in a small way what it's like to be out there in sort of public on Twitter or social media or taking stands. I'm sure I can't even begin to imagine some of the stuff that comes into your office that we don't even see
No, and you
on
shouldn't
the.
be, but I mean, the death threats, the stuff is real. To those of us who work on this stuff, it's also real. I mean, I've done a number of my team has done a number of bus takedowns over the last 2 years of ghost guns. People literally are ordering parts into communities here, and you could be living in the suburbs next to some guy. You have no idea what he's got going on in his basement. This stuff is real, and again, I think there is more of an appetite after what some, experienced on January 6th.
So I'm gonna switch total like a 180 topic wise, and I apologize to the audience. We have so many questions, we're not going to get to all of them. But this is sort of one of our council members, David, raised a question. I think it's an interesting question, although complicated, which is around the role of the Attorney General's office in enforcing state regulations around COVID and sort of education. And I'll contextualize it up front, which is it's certainly evident to those of us paying attention that there is tension between various parts of our Commonwealth about reopening of schools. You know, there are the teachers, there are parents, there are municipalities. The state has had regulations. There are municipalities that are, shall we say, going at level with the state regulations, and municipalities that are going well beyond the state regulations. And I'm going to say that this question is coming from someone who I think is asking it from the perspective of a parent. And so the question is really what, in places, and he writes, in places like Boston and Newton, the local school systems are not following the state regulations about reopening, and what is the role of the Attorney General's office in ensuring that children get the education that they need right now?
Well, it's a great question, David, and it's a big topic. My role, okay, as Attorney General has been to basically be in court defending the many challenges, whether they were challenges brought by members of churches that didn't want to wear masks, or challenges by businesses that wanted to operate. We've been successful in defending the governor's executive orders in this space. It really, I don't have enforcement authority for specific policies that have come out. I think that the philosophy of the administration has been to leave a lot of that to the local level, local boards of health. I got to say, this has been, I think, very challenging for the governor and his team. I think, though, that we have not prioritized education and in the way that we should, especially learning now about transmission rates. We know much more about transmission rates than we did in the spring. And, the spread continues to happen in parties and in group settings and not so much in the schools, although it does happen in school activities, whether it's hockey practices or basketball practices and tournaments. So, as a state where education is enshrined in our Constitution, and as a state where, we're home to the first public school in the country, we've not done a good job, and we've got a ton to make up for. We've got kids who have had, if they didn't have mental health issues a year ago, they do now. And you've got, a situation where, particularly here, you see the disparities, right? I mean, you got parents at home with both are essential workers. You've got single parents. How are you going to do Zoom school and work? You've got some situations and folks who have, the ability to band together and form pods and, maintain some semblance of normalcy for their kids. But it breaks my heart. I know, on the youth sports front, just by example, kids in Boston aren't doing that, but I've got a lot of friends in a lot of other places who are keeping up with those activities. And, that goes directly to the fact that, Boston's Boston, the average wealth of an African-American family in Boston is $8, right? The average wealth of a white family in Massachusetts is close to $300,000.
Yeah.
And so my focus with COVID, David, this doesn't exactly answer your question, but I think we got our priorities wrong. I understand the need to keep business, open and the like, but you got to protect your workers and you got to keep your kids in school. And we can make up, I think, on the economic side. Also, we've reduced spread a lot, but my real concern now is, and it always is, it's on equity, and including right now with the vaccinations. I'm not happy about the current situation. There are just too few shots out there, but it's about how those shots get prioritized, and the work around equity, making sure that our most vulnerable communities get those shots, requires almost hand-to-hand combat sometimes, door-to-door, delivering to people who can't leave their house or can't get on a bus and sure as hell can't drive to Gillette. That's where the state needs to focus, because the disparities are only going to grow. So I hope others join with me in demanding that. And I give huge credit to our hospitals who are out there and in the communities. They were the ones who in the early days banded together to get PPE, to even deliver food. They set up mobile testing units, and we're so lucky in this state to have the hospital systems that we have around the state. But they need, I think we need to continue to use our community health centers and real, neighborhood settings to deliver shots to the people who have been most vulnerable.
Well, I definitely, we share the feeling that we have a long way to go on vaccination in Massachusetts, and that racial equity and access to vaccination is a critical issue. And I will appreciate that you acknowledge that maybe we didn't quite get to the crux of David's concern in terms of sort of the schools and getting kids back in schools quite, across the Commonwealth.
I mean, I don't know how to do that, David. I just think it's a shame that we've had kids at home. They've been at home for far too long. And, I think that there should have been a much more direct and top-down requirement to get in school and make it happen. Of course, we live in a state where everything is so decentralized, 351 cities and towns, but I just think that in this time with this pandemic, less of a decentralized philosophy should govern. And, again, it's about priorities. So, I think we've got to, as we go forward, we're going to have a lot to make up for.
So we're going to wrap up in a moment here, and I'll call this both my final question, grabbing some things from the audience, and also turning it over to you to get the last word before I give some closing, just follow-up notes to the audience. And, you have been a part of or led several lawsuits against the prior administration related to immigration laws and practices. And that we at JCRC, along with our interfaith partners, have played a critical role in organizing 3 sanctuary networks here in Massachusetts. We've been running a bonding initiative to support those who've been detained by ICE. And obviously we've been working with Maura on safe communities and the driver bill, driver's license, issues that frankly, we may not exactly have been the shining city on a hill that we like to tell ourselves over the last 4 years. So I'm curious what changes you foresee in the Biden administration on immigration, and what you foresee as the change in role of your office on these issues, given the leadership you've shown. And then I would invite you also, if you have any closing thoughts or remarks for us, and then I'll wrap this up.
All right, great. Well, look, thank goodness, new administration. I mean, along the way, we fought really hard over the last 4 years to protect immigrant communities. And let's not forget, the Muslim ban is over. There's no more border wall construction. Non-citizens are going to be counted in the census. ICE enforcement is going to be scaled down. DACA has been saved and strengthened, and families are going to be reunited. We have a long way to go to reverse the cultural imprint of Trump's xenophobic policies, which my office challenged every single step of the way. But I think we'll get there with the Biden administration, which really, I think, has demonstrated a commitment to making our immigrant communities feel safer. But there's a lot of work to be done, and we need to really stay on top of this. I'll tell you right now, I mean, it plays out because people are still afraid to go to the doctors or to show up for certain visits. They're afraid of government. I mean, this is constant work. And huge credit to Eva Malone and the folks at Maura. We work with a lot to try to build that trust with our immigrant communities. But it has definitely been frayed, and it's up to all of us to build that back. I mean, we went after and we continue to go after landlords who are threatening to call ICE so as to evict tenants in violation of the moratorium. We continue to get after cases where employers are threatening, forcing workers to work with low wages or in unsafe conditions, and threatening to take their passports or to call ICE if they don't comply. So let me know about stuff, so that I can continue to take action. But this is just one of the. It's certainly not going to get any worse, and I'm optimistic at some of the changes we've seen already. And in terms of final comments, I guess I'd say I do have optimism about what's possible, because so much has been destroyed. I think about little things like the advent of telehealth, right? That would have taken years to get through in the legislature, but one pandemic and we're now more easily able to see our therapists or doctor's visits or the like. I mean, let's embrace the good that's come from this time. Let's embrace maybe the time that people have had to reflect or be at home more with families. I know that's been hard for many, but let's try to retain what was good about this period of time. Let's not forget though the tremendous loss, the tens of thousands of people who died here in Massachusetts, and then nearly 500,000 around this country. People's parents and grandparents and sisters and brothers and sons and daughters. So we've got to think about that. And I just think again, I think Massachusetts is a fantastic place, and I think that we have to continue to push. And we could do better. We could do better when it comes to education, and the kind of education that we're delivering and how our students are served. We could do better when it comes to housing. Housing is expensive across the state, and we've got a real challenge with the income gap here in the state. I think we could do even better when it comes to leading a clean energy economy. I mean, that's something that we can really drive here in Massachusetts. There's been some really good progress, but I think that's an area, that we need to really push. And finally, I think that we need to, as a country and as a state, do more to rid us of the very real and examples and feelings of anti-Semitism, of racism, of bigotry. We see how dangerous that is to the individuals, to whole communities. And, unfortunately, we've had a situation where, that's just gotten completely out of control and normalized to a certain extent. And it's appalling. And that is going to be my priority in the next couple of years. And I look forward to partnering with you in that effort. Appreciate everything that you all do, and keep in touch with me and the team. Let us know where we can be. Let us know how we can help. We really rely on you as leaders and advocates and organizers in these communities.
Well, with that, I want to thank you, Attorney General Healey. You've been incredibly generous with your time today, as you always are with us. And as you say, you use the term "let me know," and you and your team, who you've referenced many times over the last hour, and I take note of that, have been incredibly accessible and open and willing to engage and think about issues with us throughout your tenure. And we're very grateful for that partnership and friendship. We will be following up on some of the things we raised, that came up in the questions. I'm sure some of the people who asked them are going to want to know more, and we'll facilitate that. So if you're in the audience and you want to, follow up, we'll be sending out an email shortly. Just by way of FYI, For those of you in the audience who don't know about it, we did reference the definition, the working definition of anti-Semitism. We've included a link in the chat, and I'll thank Emily Reichman, our Director of Community Engagement, who organized today's event and all of our events, for doing that. If you want to learn more about JCRC's legislative priorities, we'll include a link in the chat and the follow-up to our advocacy priorities. And we also invite everybody here, including the Attorney General, to join us for our legislative reception on Thursday, March 18th at 5 p.m. We will include a link in the chat, and obviously it will be a Zoom broadcast event as opposed to a physical event at the State House, although we look forward to doing that with you, hopefully by next year this time. And finally, our next speaker series program will be with Rachel Korazim, who some of you know is an educator who meets with so many of our legislative trips and our civil society trips when they are in Israel, who talks about the Holocaust and memory. And she'll be joining us on March 24th to talk about the Holocaust in Israeli society. So again, thank you to the Attorney General. Thank you to our audience. And we look forward to seeing you all both on Zoom and in person in the very near future. Have a good day.
Terrific. Thanks, Jeremy. Be well, everyone.